Well, thanks for joining me today, Peter. I'm excited to talk with you about material shortages and availability, which is something that I think everyone's took note of in recent months. So, first, let's start by talking about your professional background. So, can you give me an overview of that?
Sure. Well, I'm a faculty director and a senior teaching specialist at the University of Minnesota's construction management program. I'm an architect by training. I was a builder by passion, and I'm a teacher at heart. So that's kind of my elevator pitch. But I
Yeah.
was a general contractor for, I don't know, 16 years with my own firm, also do the design side. So quite a bit of broad experience in the business. So as
Okay.
well as teaching for
Yeah.
23 years.
Wow. Okay. Great. So, with your background, you obviously have extensive experience in material pricing and availability. So, this is a big question to start off with, but what's going on in terms of craft labor shortages and how did the pandemic impact that?
Well, the crazy thing about the craft labor shortages is it was here before the pandemic. All
Mhm.
right. And so that was probably the number one complaint I heard from members of our industry advisory board is just labor shortage, labor shortage, labor shortage. And then the pandemic hit. And of course, that was an unexpected situation that impacted labor in a variety of ways, with a lot of people staying home. And of course, as it carried on, some contractors were continuing to build under, um, you know, different circumstances, very careful circumstances. So, but a
Mhm.
lot of some craft labor has left the industry, especially the older workers that finally said, you know what, I'm just going to retire now. And so we've lost a little bit of that. I think on some of the younger side, I don't have, hard evidence of this, but I think some of them are realizing, well, the job market has really opened up in a lot of other careers as well. I don't necessarily need to be swinging a hammer anymore.
Mhm.
And so that's causing further problems. But for the most part, it's the supply and demand side of the industry as well um, that's combined with having not enough labor to service that market that
Mhm.
provides that perception of the labor shortage to the lay people. In other words, we may see it as a labor shortage. A company may not have any fewer workers than it did before, but because they have so much more work and they have to spread it around, they've only got so many people to spread around. So
Mhm.
that's one of the big limiting factors. So
Okay.
it's a combination of things, but really the labor shortage issue started well before the pandemic and has been with us for quite some time. Attracting workers into this industry has always been difficult because it's labor intensive, even though it is a very, very high paying industry.
Mhm.
But it is labor, it's
Mhm.
hard work.
Yeah, yeah. So, what impacts have we seen play out in the residential market? I'm assuming those impacts were here before and during the pandemic, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
We're seeing, craft shortages, like I said, before and, um, after the pandemic or more recently. But it's just been, again, I think that the impact is that there is so much demand out there that even the labor that we have, if COVID hadn't existed, all right, and we had this sudden surge in demand, we would still have a labor shortage problem exacerbated by the fact that there's more work out there.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So there's only so many people around to do the work,
Hmm.
and there are so many job openings available across the spectrum of our economy that it's become an issue of attracting workers
Hmm.
into the industry to service that demand. And I could be talking about construction. I could be talking about any number of industries right now that are searching for people. There's only so many of us to go around.
Right. So, how does the industry adapt to a labor shortage? What do those changes look like?
Well, there's a number of things that what I would call new old techniques.
Okay.
Let's call older techniques that are being rediscovered. But things such as prefabrication is starting to take off. And that was actually a trend starting before COVID hit, where companies were looking at ways to prefabricate assemblies. That could be wall panels, it could be plumbing assemblies, it could be entirely finished units, to look at how that could be adapted into the workplace. Some recent research that I've done suggests that Europe is a little bit farther ahead than we are in this country in sort of looking at prefabricated Lego style apartment blocks, for example,
Sure.
with fully finished units.
Yeah.
And that will start to come into the marketplace as well. But that's one of the ways that the labor shortage is being addressed is primarily with prefabrication, because it's the one that has the quickest adaptability in the industry. The other one is perhaps less so in residential, would be technology improvements. So robotics, automatically, well, I forget the term right now, but where you basically are 3D printing houses. That technology is starting to come into play here. Is not near a position to where it can fulfill the market demand right now. But those are the ways that people are looking at in the future of solving the labor shortage demand, because I'm not seeing, when you look at the demographics, that the labor availability is going to get, in any way, shape, or form a lot better in the long run. I think we're going to be stuck with labor shortages for quite some time and have to learn to adapt.
That's interesting. Well, as a professor, I'm curious what you hear from students today who are interested in the field. What are their motivations for getting into it?
Well, the biggest motivation that I see in my students is just they want to see something get built. They want to actually be
Sure.
part of that building process. It's
Yeah.
exciting to see something that comes from a set of drawings that they can watch grow and manage all those parts and pieces that go together, because we have to remember that a building is a complicated puzzle where in a lot of respects no two buildings are alike, so every puzzle is different, and so it's a changed experience every day, every project, that sort of a thing. And so that's what really draws a lot of people's excitement, my students particularly. And it's such a large industry in terms of the construction industry as a whole, in terms of the gross domestic product, is relatively significant. And so when you think about all the people on the supply side, on the subcontractors, general contractors, specialty contractors, infrastructure, home building, you name it, there is so much, such a wide open field there that there's a great deal of opportunity. And that's what excites students.
Okay, well, that's interesting. To back up a little bit and chat more about solutions. So one narrative that you hear, I think, throughout multiple media sources is the fact that wages aren't high enough. And just to kind of pick your brain on this, is this a problem plaguing the construction industry as well?
Well, it depends on who you ask.
Sure.
You ask the craft worker, says, yes, I'd like to get some more money. Of course I would, yes.
Yeah.
There's never enough money. But the fact of the matter is that the construction industry as a whole has actually been fairly well paid. And that is one of the things that attracts certainly my students to the industry. But it doesn't take that long. When you think about the craft worker, for example, it doesn't require a 4-year degree. It can require perhaps an associate's degree or even just apprenticeship training. They're not going to be burdened with that college tuition bill over a long period of time, and the rise of income over a period of time is relatively significant. I mean, there's 6 digits in your salary is not uncommon for an experienced trade craftsman working for a lot of years. So it takes a little bit longer for people in the management side to kind of catch up to that. But no, it's construction has been considered well paid. And now with the labor shortage, I'm starting to see that in order to able to attract workers to a company, companies are finding themselves having to pay more. And so the supply and demand side is causing that compensation level to rise sort of naturally.
Okay, great. Well, that's a good thing for your students, definitely.
Yes.
And I mean, speaking of supply and demand, I think another kind of hot topic in the industry is material pricing. So I kind of wanted to pivot and chat about that a little bit. So, like I asked with the craft labor market, can you give me an overview of what, material pricing has looked like throughout the pandemic and right now?
Well, the pandemic really turned the supply side of the market upside down when all of a sudden those companies that would be providing inventory to suppliers themselves were shutting down their factories. So, and because nobody was theoretically buying, the inventory that was on hand at the time was flowing out quickly. And from what I understand, primarily, at least initially, through the home remodeling side, where everybody realized, oh my gosh, I'm home. How am I possibly going to manage my work? Kids going to school in this house. I've got to do something. I'm going to go to Home Depot. I'm going to go to Lowe's. I'm going to buy the stuff I need to do that little cubby hole over there or make that remodel. And that was a surge in demand. As a matter of fact, stocks of those retailers, skyrocketed during the pandemic, as well as the call for remodeling. So a lot of that remodeling was sucking some of that inventory supply into the marketplace, but it wasn't getting backfilled. It wasn't getting backfilled enough at the plant side because of the shutdowns. You combine that with even pre-pandemic, the tariffs that were put on, for example, on Canadian lumber, which was like 20%, something like that, that also affected the supply side. Even though it was pre-pandemic, it couldn't have happened at a worse time as far as that's concerned. So it was sort of an aggregation of things where, prices went well past $1,000 per board foot for lumber, which, is considered stratospheric to a builder. All right.
Sure.
The average price of lumber for a home was back even a couple of months ago was rising to averaging about $30,000 more for the price of a home, or 10%. So that is not insignificant at all. And but it is a very cyclical kind of a pricing market. We've seen a backslide in pricing recently, which is encouraging. But it's probably that's as the supply continues to backfill now, then the price of lumber will come down. But we've also seen drywall, steel, anything that's made out of steel, which is studs, appliances, things like that, fasteners even. All of those things have been affected by shortages and cost increases as well. Things like glue, caulk, doors, cabinetry, things that are made out of wood products, not necessarily sawn lumber, but the byproduct of sawn lumber, things like that. It's just been basically across the board that contractors have been facing shortages, both commercially and residentially. It's quite significant.
Okay. Do you see a majority of contractors just kind of biting the bullet and buying into those higher prices, or are some people holding off now and hoping that the market kind of evens itself out?
Well, okay, that's a kind of a loaded question, because if a contractor was already signed to a contract that did not have an escalation clause in it, and basically has a client that is unyielding on the contract given these extraordinary events, then the contractor's kind of stuck with it. And oftentimes that's going to fall down to the subcontractors, unless the general contractor is self-performing work. You've got to think of all those shortages and those price increases falling down into the plumber, all right, or to the prefabricator, or to the lumber mill, or something like that. That the contractor now has to absorb those costs within the contract, unless the owner is willing to, accommodate this extraordinary circumstance, which the contract will be the dictator in that, in a lot of cases. However, if a client hasn't started a project yet, and you see these price increases all of a starting to accumulate, and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, but you haven't signed the contract yet, but I have to tell you that the price just went up another 10%," that might put a pause on a developer or owner or somebody, saying, "Let's just stop, take a breath, and pause." And that we've seen that happen. We've seen projects get canceled not only because of COVID, but because of the price increase, and availability, the length of time it's taking to build. The shortages of the material extend the schedule as well. So it's a complicated stew. That's really what I could tell you.
Okay. So these projects that have been canceled, do those reside in a certain market of the industry, or are they widespread?
Widespread.
Widespread.
Now, probably less so, I would say, I would say in the vertical construction side, they're probably most affected, which would be buildings. Okay, when you look at highway heavy and infrastructure, that's primarily focused on concrete. They may still rely on steel and other commodities, but they're probably going to be less affected, especially because their contracts are usually of longer duration, schedules are of longer duration. And oftentimes within a lot of public sector contracts, there are escalation, at least some of them, there are escalation clauses within the contracts that are developed. So, or the developers and the DOTs and so forth can reduce scope in order to accommodate that, or to extend schedules so that a contractor could wait until the price gets to the right point, or when they can get materials without penalty. So there are different ways to accommodate that.
Okay. Okay. Well, one of my last questions for you here is to ask your advice on how contractors and builders should navigate this environment. So let's say you have a contractor right now looking at starting a project. They don't have contract signed or anything, but they're looking to start a project. What do you suggest they do? How do you suggest they navigate this market?
Well, what I would say, Kelly, is that contractors probably know how to navigate this market, and the way that that's traditionally been done is saying, my prices are going up, my prices are going up, I need to pass along those prices. Okay, I think, if I might, that the proper question is, what does the developer of the project do? What does the homeowner do in this situation? Okay, because remember that to get a house done, to get a building done, requires the cooperation of the owner and the contractor. And the most important thing that they need to do is to both be aware of this volatile situation and to communicate regularly. All right, that's the best advice I can give. Absent that communication, the worst thing that you remodeling your house would want to find out is when the contractor's all done and hands you a bill for 10% more because of the lumber that they bought 2 months ago. That doesn't work so well for you, right? You've already planned everything out. You were making assumptions, so you have to have that dialogue right from the beginning on what this market means to the project and how you're going to manage through that. So what the homeowner, what the owner of the project needs to do is be patient, recognize that it's not necessarily the contractor's fault, okay, that this is a market-driven situation, but you need to be patient. you need to expect that schedules will be drawn out because of material shortages. Even if we're not talking price, material shortages will cause projects to take longer to complete, which might mean more interest expense on your construction loan, okay? So the owner is the ultimate person responsible for the project, okay, and how it gets delivered. So they have to be part of the dialogue. The contractor needs to include them as part of the dialogue. You have to have the discussion, and you have to build in some contingencies, both in schedule and in cost, in order to get a project done in this environment. It will all settle down, all right? It will. So there is always an option to wait, but you know, Kelly, I know you're impatient. You want to get that remodeling done, okay? So you have to make a decision. Am I going to absorb that cost, or am I going to wait, all right? And eventually things are going to settle out. We are going to see factors such as inflation. We're going to see, which isn't necessarily bad, by the way. We are going to see these increased costs become stabilized, but we're probably never going to see them go backward to where they were. All right, that would be an unreasonable expectation, you know, across the board. Things are going to be more expensive. This is kind of like a blip in the curve that constantly kind of goes up, all right, until you hit another recession where things drop down again. We don't want to be there. That would be the worst thing for our economy.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, $1 million question here. When do you expect things to return to some sort of normal in terms of material pricing, I should say?
Well, we're already starting to see that, like in lumber, for example, because it's interesting to read. Even in Minnesota, we have that new initiative for the, you know, I forget how big a lumber mill that's being planned for northern Minnesota right now in the Iron Range. That's terrific news. And we're starting to see that across the spectrum, that the supply side of the lumber industry is ramping up their capacity to deliver. Why? It's not, they are seeing that the demand side for the housing and all of these projects is not going to go away anytime soon. But as there are more suppliers, that means that the lumber price will continue to come down. Supply side will stabilize. The market will become a little bit more competitive for lumber, and we will forget this even happened at some point. That'll probably be in 2022 is where I expect us to see more stabilization in that. Steel, again, I think it's the same issue, similar as lumber. Is part of it is capacity. So I would definitely think that the COVID impacts are disappearing very quickly. We're getting past that, luckily. That was significant. That won't be a factor. Interest rates, however, could be a factor. But right now, the Fed is doing a pretty good job of keeping them tamped down. But here again, even a slight rise in interest rates are not going to be catastrophic for the industry. It's the large, big steps that would be a problem. I think remodeling is here to stay. I absolutely think it's here to stay because the supply of houses ready to buy is so hot right now. I mean, there's a low supply, high demand, people paying premiums over the asking price for existing homes right now means that people will be doing additions, remodeling, stuff like that, as opposed to paying those prices. Will stay put. So I see the remodeling industry as continuing to be red hot. The only sectors that I think are going to be affected COVID-wise are going to be basically the office sector, when we realize that, hey, you know, a certain portion of our employees can work from home. That's going to change the office market. And but I think we're still going to see remodeling happening in those markets, a repurposing of existing space, not necessarily a wide increase of new space out there. You know, manufacturing, I think, is going to continue to be robust and expand as it is presently. So I only see a few areas where the market might not go in the direction people want, but you have to be able to diversify. Luckily, I think hospitality, entertainment, even restaurants, I think are going to rebound. And we're going to see some remodeling in those sectors as well.
Okay, great. Well, that was it for everything I wanted to ask. So is there anything else you wanted to add in or emphasize in our last minute here?
Be patient. We'll get through this. That's the best advice I can give you. Just be patient and continue to communicate.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for your time, Peter. I appreciate it.
All right, not a problem. Happy to do it.